students, and welcome to Mr. Sandwich Reads. I am, as always, Mr. Sandwich, and today we're going to read about the writer of the Odyssey, which we've been reading. We're going to learn about Homer. To do this, we're going to use what's called a KWL chart, and we're going to start with that. Now, we want to fill in 2/3 of the chart before we get going, and then save the last third for after we're done reading. We can add to it as well in between articles. We're going to read 2 articles, both about Homer, and see what we can fill in here. Now, let's go first with what we know about Homer and about the time that the Odyssey was written. Now, Homer wrote both. I'm going to add both. The Iliad was written first, and maybe there's one L in Iliad, and the Odyssey. Okay. So Homer wrote both of those. And by wrote, I should put that in quotations because we really mean told the tale. So I'm going to also add, because I know that this is before the printing press, it's before people even started to jot down these stories. So originally was told by word of mouth. It was memorized. We're going to read today that part of why it's in poetic verse, which we've talked about, which used, I'm actually going to add that too to what I know about Homer, used poetic verse. That was because it was from the oral tradition, storytelling tradition. It was word of mouth. People had to memorize what they were going to share. So it being in poetic verse was a bit easier. Okay, used poetic verse, and I'm going to say instead of wrote stories, shared stories from roughly 3,000 years ago. Okay, that's about it. That's the extent of knowledge. Any other knowledge I have about Homer really is going to come from the texts we're about to read, so I'm going to hold off on that. So what do I already know? So again, KWL, I didn't mention this at the top. KWL is what we know, what we want to know, so going into our text with some questions, and then ultimately what we learned from those. So what we know, it's all right if we have no background knowledge, though give yourself some credit. You may know a few things more that you realized. A lot of people, I don't know if Homer Simpson's named after him, but they knew Homer. I'm trying to think what other questions I got. But that's going to lead us on over to what we want to know. I had one student that wanted to know, when were these stories shared? And these are all going to be questions. What do we want to know? When were these stories shared? I had students asking, were these stories based on history? True events. That's what my students really want to know. So as we read today, we're going to go in with that lens, specifically of what parts of these stories, if any, were true. All right, what else do we want to know? Somebody else had asked me, was blue a color back then? And they had said that they heard, their stepmom told them that blue wasn't a color, and that's why when we read all the descriptions of the sea, that we get like the wine-colored sea or gray. I've seen a few different shades, but none blue. And the theory there was that blue wasn't even a color back then. So another question that we could ask. All right, so let's jump into our text. And first we're going to read about the author. So let's do that right now. All right, students, here we are. We're on about the author, and we're going to read about Homer, writer of the Odyssey, and also we may know the Iliad. And we're going to want to add that to our KWL. I'm also going to turn on the Read Write app so that I can highlight as we go. Okay, this is about the author. Let me zoom in so you can follow along at home. I'm also going to actually use, where's my scroller here? So here you can follow along maybe a little easier. I'm going to use the scroller. About the author. There are many thoughts on who Homer actually was. Some scholars believe that he was a blind man who lived in Greece around 700 BC. Others believe that Homer was actually an embodiment of several different men, all of whom collaborated on the 2 epic poems entitled The Iliad and The Odyssey. We may never know who Homer truly was. 7 different city-states in Greece each claimed the honor of being Homer's birthplace, But if Homer ever did exist, he probably lived in Chios. The dialect used in the Odyssey is that of Asian Ionian, Greek, which was common in the area of Chios at the time this epic was written. Common thought is that the Iliad was written approximately 750 BC and the Odyssey some 30 years later, around 720 BC. I got some words cut off here. So something likely the epic poem was composed during this time and then written out centuries later. So remember, this was traditionally oral storytelling, so it would have been just passed down word of mouth, and that's what this is saying, and then written later. At that point, adapted, just like we're reading an adaptation. If this is true, then Homer wrote about a very different time than the one in which he lived. During 720 BC, Greece consisted of scattered independent city-states. This poem appears to chronicle the golden age of Greece. In the Odyssey, Homer describes an aristocratic society. This is first seen on the island of Ithaca, when after Odysseus departs, the society of the island becomes chaotic. The society of the island becomes chaotic. Penelope, Odysseus' wife, is alone and frightened, and Telemachus is too young to assume leadership. Combined with the arrival of the suitors, the small society is thrown into turmoil, and only the return of Odysseus, or the interference of the gods, can return the society to normal. During the Homeric age, there were very few people who could read and write, and so stories were passed down orally. This is the reason that nearly all writing was put into the form of poetry. Rhyme is easier to remember. Sometimes these stories were read in the form of plays. These plays were performed in a Greek theater, and the actors wore masks and high platform shoes, which forced them to move around very slowly. The theater had no scenery, was out in the open air, and had no actresses, only actors. There were only two types of plays: tragedies and comedies. One of the favorite tragedies was about the Trojan War, which is the first topic that Homer wrote about. The challenge presented to poets was to tell an old story in a new and exciting way, which Homer does most effectively. We have, over the last 3,000 years, only possessed about 6 to 10 great epics. 2 of these are by Homer. Aristotle once said that the epic ranked second only to tragedy, and many people still agree. All right, so now that we're done reading the text, let's go back in with a highlighter, and I'm just going to use the Lumio highlighter here in yellow. Zoom in, and I do want to mention scholars believe that he was a blind man. We're going to get more specifics on that in our next passage, possibly challenging that idea. I don't want to say debunking it, but kind of challenging it. But lived in Greece in 700 BC. I think that would be good to add, if we didn't know that already, to our Learn section in the KWL. He possibly lived in Chios, and that's based on the dialect used in the Odyssey. So I think that's interesting that they used the linguistics, the language, to try to help identify where he was from. Now, we did mention the Iliad and the Odyssey. That was in my pre-reading knowledge. You can see, though, that there was about a 30-year difference between them if you want to get more specifics with those dates. Let's see. Homer describes an aristocratic party. Okay, let's give us a little background information there. Homeric age, the Homeric age. Few people, I like this fact, and I think this is important too, especially, so the stories were passed down orally. Few people could read and write back then. Still wanted stories, right? There's always been storytelling, but few people could read and write. It's also worth, this poem appears to be in the golden age of Greece. I also want to add that. And they mention aristocratic society. That's a wealthy, well-to-do society, and the golden age of Greece, I think, encaptures that. One of my favorite tragedies. We've also got a few other things about that time of the story. About these plays were performed in Greek theaters. Actors wore masks, platform shoes so they could be seen. out in the open air. There were no actresses, only actors playing all of the parts. And there were only two types of plays, tragedies, and comedies. Those were like the original genres. It was either things were going to turn out better for the hero in the end, and it would be a comedy of sorts, or things were going to turn out much worse, and it would be a tragedy. You have to tell me what you think in the end. Is the Odyssey a tragedy or a comedy? It is certainly an epic. All right. Well, now let's check out our what we can add to the KWL. Let's go to that before anything else. What did we add? They were written about 30 years apart. Only actors, no actresses back then. Performed outdoors. Let me just jump back. The Odyssey takes place during Greece's golden age. And quotations there. Homer was thought to be blind. We're going to find out more about that in our next passage. And let's put only comedies and tragedies. Also, most people couldn't read or write back then. All right, so you can see I've added to the KWL as I'm going. Now we're going to jump into another article there. Who was Homer? And we'll read that and see if we can glean any additional information there. Who was Homer? The Iliad and the Odyssey are two of the world's most famous poems, but very little is known about their creator, Homer. Historian and writer Daisy Dunn goes in search of the poet of the Trojan War, exploring who Homer was and whether he ever actually existed. The Greek hero Odysseus spent 10 long years striving to return home after the Trojan War. The stories of how he tricked the one-eyed Cyclops, evaded the flesh-eating Laestrygonians, and resisted the lure of the sirens as he struggled to reach Ithaca are some of the most memorable in Homer's Odyssey. These stories may be fictional, but they form the heart of a poem that has reverberated down the centuries as a vessel of eternal truths. For centuries, people have been trying to discover who was behind the timeless tales of the Odyssey and its predecessor, the Iliad. Homer, the name attached to the two poems, remains a mysterious figure. Was he a man? Was Homer a group or lineage of poets? Was Homer a woman? The late 19th century novelist Samuel Butler was convinced that the author of the Odyssey, at least, was female. For most people in antiquity, however, the two epics were the products of a single male mind. In the 2nd century AD, a satirical writer named Lucian imagined meeting the poet and interrogating him as to who he truly was. Homer revealed to him that many people believed he came from Aegean, and I know this is in the text too, Aegean, I want to say, island of Chios, or from Smyrna or Colophon, on the west coast of what is now Turkey. I could say Turkey, that's easy enough. While his words were to be taken lightly, scholars today consider it highly probable that the Homeric poems did indeed originate in these parts. Their Greek, while not one that was ever spoken, is overall more typical of the ancient dialects of the west coast of Turkey and the islands just off the coast than it is of those of mainland Greece. Here we see that's Chios, and that was mentioned in both articles that we're reading here today. Homer was associated with this part of the world from a very early date. Several writers described a talented poet of Chios, where a group of performing bards calling themselves the Homeridae, or children of Homer, had also established itself by the 6th century BC. References also exist in the early sources to Homer being conceived on the island of Los or at Syme and being born at Smyrna, modern day Izmir. Ancient writers had various ideas about what Homer looked like. The word Homerus could mean hostage in Greek, so many imagined that he was a captive. But Homerus also could mean blind, and the image of a blind bard proved particularly compelling. One reason for this was that the Odyssey features a blind but immensely talented poet named Demodocus who recites his work before a royal court. It is possible that the blindness of Homer was a myth invented to account for the fact that the Homeric poems originally evolved orally before the development of writing in Greece, by being performed and passed down from bard to bard. And I wanted to mention bard is a storyteller. That's all you need to know. They keep mentioning a bard. William Shakespeare's a renowned bard, famous storyteller. Like the blind poet Demodocus in the Odyssey, a bard would have sung the poems before an audience, repeating passages and set phrases such as godlike Odysseus to satisfy the poetic meter. The Iliad and the Odyssey are conventionally dated to the late 8th or early 7th century BC. By this time, the use of writing was becoming more widespread in Greece, and it seems that the poems were also set down for the first time. But it's clear that the poems contain features preserved from the pre-writing age. The story of the origins of the Trojan War, for example, in which Paris, Prince of Troy, granted Aphrodite, goddess of love, the golden apple, is alluded to only briefly by Homer. It's taken for granted that anyone coming to the poems would already have known the details. The story of the judgment of Paris, in other words, is at least contemporary, if not older, than the poems themselves. The poems may also preserve memories of an earlier heroic age. The men of this time are presented as far stronger and mightier than those who come after them. Many scholars today believe that if anything like the Trojan War ever happened, the most feasible historical background for the heroic age of the epics is the late Bronze Age, about 400 years before the Iliad and the Odyssey were first written down. Still today, the monumental architecture of the city of Troy speaks of the highly developed civilization that flourished in this period in Anatolia. It finds its counterpart in the grand palaces that Mycenaean Greeks built in the Peloponnese in the period between 16 and 1200 BC. The precise reasons for why their civilization collapsed in the 12th century BC are still a matter of scholarly debate. The poems contain descriptions which evoke this glorious lost age, but they also contain details which derive from later times. There is a reference to the building of temples to the gods, for example, but the earliest Greek temples to the gods that we know of were constructed in the 8th century BC. It is partly accidental that the Homeric epics are such a chronological jumble. They preserve real memories and traces and phrases of the ancient past, and partly intentional. The war is set in the ancient past, so words and objects were chosen to characterize this earlier time. So where might Homer fit into this? Going on the theory that there was a Homer, perhaps a poet who was born in Smyrna and worked on Chios, was he the original storyteller who came up with the plots of the epics, influenced perhaps by a conflict just north of where he came from, at Troy? Or was Homer at the other end of the process? After being passed orally from generation to generation, the poems must have been refined when they were written down for the first time. So should we think of Homer as a sort of editor who shaped the inherited material into the complete poems? Or is Homer more a spirit than anything else, simply a name given to a pair of remarkable poems which evolved and grew over hundreds of years and which can't be attributed to anyone in particular? Everyone is entitled to their own view on this. My own is that it is not inconceivable that there was an original bard who came from the part of the world that we now know formed the settling of the poems. Perhaps he composed the epics in outline, building on stories passed down from his parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, which later poets developed and perpetrated orally. Finally, these poems were written down. It's for each of us to decide whether to believe in one Homer or in many, in a blind bard or in a spirit that encapsulates the most astonishing process of preservation of stories told long ago. What is important is that we have the poems at all and continue to recognize their worth. It is uplifting to think that we can find as much joy in Homer's poetry today as our forebears did 3,000 years ago.
All right, students, now that you have read both articles, I want you to go back to the KWL and fill in that learned part. You can see here a few things I added was that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written 30 years apart, that there were only actors and not actresses back then. These would have been performed outside. That this takes place during Greece's Golden Age. Uh, we learned a bit about Homer was thought to be blind, but you could also add a little bit more to that and why they think that may have not been true, but may have been believed. How did that come about? That there were only comedies and tragedies as far as our two genres, and that most people could not read and write back then. And I mentioned that also during class and during our reading of the Siren. So go ahead, see what else you can collaborate based on those two articles you read, and really fill in what you learned there. If there's any other questions that came up, you could also add to the want to know. So I look forward to seeing your KWLs and having an enriching conversation about Homer. All right, get to it, get busy. Thanks.